So I'm sitting here with Stephen M Rosen, and we start chatting now. We just have some introduction, and I have a first question, and I've been looking into the article you wrote, the latest article, I think. I'm not sure, from 2014, semiotics. And there was some mentioning of Cézanne in connection with Merleau-Ponty. And these are things I've been thinking for, I don't know how long, 20, 25 years. And it has never gotten to my understanding. I see the text or what is explained to me, but true understanding hasn't been there, like embodied until, I would say, just now almost. And that's the first dimension by Merleau-Ponty, and that objects and space, they are together, or something is before them, like a priori almost. So the space is both the Cartesian, what later becomes the Cartesian space, and the objects in it, in one simultaneous go. I'm really happy. I think I got to the understanding, but maybe you can say something and I can sort of check it out if I got it correctly, or somewhere in the neighborhood.
Well, first, that article from 2014 was not my last article. I've done several more in 2017, 2021, 2022. So there have been more recent ones, but that theme, I assume you're referring to this term I've used, object in space before subject.
Yes.
And this whole arrangement, this classical post-Renaissance arrangement of objects appearing before detached subjects, appearing in space, in a spatial context, before detached subjects, that whole arrangement that has guided human perception, and in particular science, came out of, as you say, a first dimension, a precursor to that. Merleau-Ponty called it the depth dimension, which he described as the first dimension. In that first dimension, we don't have a detachment of an observer or subject from objects, and we don't have space in the classical sense of space. We have a merging of subject and object in that original version of dimension of space, a merging of subject, object, and space. They're all bundled and balled together in a single experience. From a phenomenological standpoint, and I'm of course talking about Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, ontophenomenology, ontological phenomenology. From that standpoint, we have a life world in which space contains itself along with subject and object, contained in that same dynamic flow from subject to object to space. It's a dynamic flow. They are not simply partitioned and separated from each other, but they all flow together. And out of that, in the course of human history, the development of human culture and the development of human cognition, out of that developmental process, we then have the separations that have been created. object and space before subject, all separated from each other. So that, I hope that conveys a sense of how I've been thinking about this for the past couple of decades, if not more.
Wow, I think I have come across it, put in other terms. I'm not sure. I have to say I'm not completely sure, but it's an interesting story. There was a Tibetan missionary coming to California, I think, and he began to teach his Tibetan Buddhist religious doctrines and sutras and all that. And then he I think he had a sort of feeling it didn't really caught on properly or something like that, and he figured out maybe in the Western Hemisphere there could be an establishment of this subject in front of space wherein object is situated, something of that sort. So he wrote a whole book series that were completely, so to speak, neutral, not involving Tibetan Buddhism or any philosophical school or anywhere, trying to make a path for people to come to that understanding. And in quite similar terms, he tried to explain what you wrote, which I've now finally got, thanks to you, that space and the objects in space are not separate, or maybe not even separable. And if we were
not in the pre-Renaissance, let us say, not in that experience of space, they're not separable, and only became separated with the further development of human cognition and culture. Yeah. So who was this Tibetan?
I don't know how famous his name, but his name was, let's see, Tartan Tulku. Tulku, I think it's an honorary title, and his first name, I think, was Tartan.
You know that name? Tulku, yeah. Huh.
It's oddly similar. But it's so I'm trying to get my head around it for these decades they've gone, and now it's like, yes, of course, objects in space are not separable in that pre-thing, and it could even be, and I'm just chancing here, that in a way the objects are a derivative of this original depth or space, and maybe even in some way they are not, you cannot use the objects to get to the original space. There's not sufficient in them.
Yeah.
Maybe some sort of randomness, or I don't know how to express it really.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there was the original space, the depth dimension, in Merleau-Ponty's terms, and then separation arose from that, separation of subject, object, and space. And now the challenge is to recover that original experience without simply erasing the separation. You cannot erase the separation.
No.
And pretend that we've gone back to an earlier undifferentiated stage. We can't do that even if we wanted to. So somehow there's a reprise, an encore of the original condition, coinciding with, integrated with the separation. So you have this paradoxical, radically non-dualist situation where there is both separation and non-separation, and somehow this the discontinuity and continuity themselves become integrated, themselves flow together. So there is no longer a dualism of continuity and discontinuity.
Oh,
So the
yeah.
continuity would be the holistic inseparability of subject, object, and space, and the discontinuity is the Cartesian experience that we've been governed by for the past, 400, 300, 400 years. And so now is the opportunity for bringing those two together. I think ultimately it's a question of needing to embrace the paradox. And our language, when we try to embrace paradox, our language is saying to us, no.
Yeah, definitely.
The language, we've discussed it before, the language is structured in such a way that paradoxes are anathema. We can't tolerate paradoxes. We find them threatening and perhaps even life-threatening. We're used to the separations that have been established. But the separations have become so extreme, the polarization so great, that now we either face and accept the paradox or we fall to the separation, to the dualism. We are destroyed by it. So it's really a question of do or die, as I see it.
Yeah.
And it has to happen on an embodied level, because these words I'm saying to you now are words of my intellect. Unfortunately, I have not reached the point where I can bring these concepts down into my body and embody them the way they need to be embodied to make them into a reality. I tried doing something like that. Maybe I succeeded. If I succeeded, it was to a limited extent in Topologies of the Flesh, that 2006 book.
That's a great one.
And I've tried it in other work of mine and in my life. I've tried to observe my dualistic tendencies, dividing subject from object, dividing myself from others, from you, Hans. And it is a great challenge to be able to function holistically in the kind of life world that Merleau-Ponty described, where subjects and objects flow so intimately together that, I'm roughly paraphrasing him, you no longer know which the subject is and which the object is, because they're so fluidly, relating to each other. And yet the paradox is that there are still distinctions, so it doesn't all dissolve into a world that is entirely undifferentiated.
No.
I mean, the pre-Renaissance and perhaps pre-Greek world may have involved a lack of differentiation that had no differences.
Yes.
So there was no paradox. It was just all of a piece. But today, now that we've been marked and structured by this dualism, the only thing we can do is try to recover the original wholeness without sacrificing our sense of distinctness and separation.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And paradoxically have them blended together.
That would be a complementarity between continuity and discontinuity.
And get it into our bodies.
Wow. I was thinking also, I asked you a question over mail, and thank you very much for the answer. It was great, and it's I took an interest in the Ozma problem and chirality, and to me at that instant it seemed that chirality is some sort of first difference or first differentiation. And in some ways, chirality is inherently coming or not externally describable in the Cartesian orthogonal XYZ lines. You cannot put it into that because the chirality comes from within. And therefore it cannot, according to Gardner's example, be transferred to an alien civilization called the Ozma culture or something similar. And that made me thinking, oh, it's almost like chirality is before everything else. And what I usually, if you talk about embodied, I structure my body to the Newtonian or Cartesian, up and down. I go up and I go to the front. And in some ways, they nullify each other. Up equals down, and the end, because they make themselves null together. Front and back makes themselves null. So it opens up for complete relativism without any properties at all. And I was thinking maybe chirality, since it's not prone to nullification in that term, that it is inherently a directionality that comes from the embodiment, maybe you can say, itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is, as you're saying, it isn't a relative concept. There's something ingrained in nature, perhaps, that has this asymmetry. So the asymmetry takes on an absolute quality, not relative. And my understanding would be, if that's true, that would be a way of communicating with another culture through chirality.
Ah.
I don't know if what I just said is entirely clear. My own thinking about it, about symmetry and asymmetry, and what I called sinsymmetry.
Yes, sinsymmetry, yes.
Yeah, that was a 1975 paper titled Sinsymmetry.
Ah.
And what I what I had in mind then is that there is a non-relative process built into the universe in which you begin with no distinction between symmetry and asymmetry,
Okay.
which is not to say that it is symmetric. It is neither symmetric,
I get it.
nor
Yes,
is
yes.
it asymmetric. I think this is one of this neither nor comes out of Zen thinking, and it's characteristic of Taoism. But then again, it comes down to what I was saying a little earlier today and what I've written about. What arises from that original neither nor of symmetry and asymmetry is a differentiation of symmetry and asymmetry. So along with the differentiation of continuity and discontinuity, that has arisen in our culture, symmetry and asymmetry have been differentiated. And in the core, and you could describe cosmogony in this way. Cosmologists talk about, and physicists talk about symmetry breaking.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But what I've suggested is originally there was no symmetry to break. There was neither symmetry nor asymmetry. Then the distinction between symmetry and asymmetry arose. And only in that context have you been able to talk about symmetry breaking.
Yes.
Break the symmetry and introduce an asymmetry. But then, and that's all within the framework, the classical framework, the Newtonian Cartesian framework, this differentiation of symmetry and asymmetry that allows you to speak about breaking symmetry.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then, in the post-Cartesian world, the post-Newtonian world that people are exploring today, that you and I have been exploring,
Oh yeah, definitely.
there would be an integration of symmetry and asymmetry. So first, neither symmetry nor asymmetry, then differentiation of symmetry and asymmetry, and then perhaps an integration of them. And you see this in the Klein bottle, which we've spoken about many times. In that kind of topological structure, interpreted non-classically, because mathematicians have interpreted the Klein bottle in a classical way that sort of wrings all the juice out of the Klein bottle.
Yeah, definitely.
An object. They've rendered it an object rather than something that can integrate subject and object. So that indicates an integration of symmetry and asymmetry, for me, the Klein bottle. How that relates to the Ozma problem is not entirely clear to me, but what I would say is, in the view I have just described, we don't have a pure relativization of asymmetry or chirality. If it's purely relative, then basically you have symmetry and you can't communicate to an alien communication.
Yes.
The meaning of asymmetry. So it's only within a framework like the one I've described where you see asymmetry or chirality playing a fundamental role rather than just being washed out into an ultimately symmetric picture. It's only in that context that asymmetry has a meaning independent of...
Oh yeah, I get it. Thanks. Cheers. Wow.
So that's what I would make of that issue at the moment.
Very good. I think the coin dropped now, as we say in Swedish. Why? Cheers.
Yeah.
I have another question that is loosely but a bit lighter. You mentioned mathematics, and I've been in contact with some mathematicians who are doing the Bishop mathematics, which is what they call constructive mathematics. And they see this fixation with the law of the excluded middle as problematic, something that, if I understood it correctly, originally, even until the mid-19th century, mathematicians thought it to be something to be used, but not something to be believed in completely. And then it took over, and today it is confused with reality, the law of the excluded middle, and it has like a limiting factor on mathematics, making it less creative, less embodied and human. The constructivist mathematicians say it should be used when it's apt, when it suits the purpose. It should not be a ruling substratum that tells you where mathematics should go. And for me, I realized, since this is a rather new movement, it started in the rather early 19th century, or early 20th century, or late 19th century. It cannot be the true movement of mathematics, but now it's taken over completely. And one fellow I spoke to, it's on the tip of my tongue, his name, I will find it out. He said it's strangling mathematics, it's strangling the creativity of mathematics.
Yeah, right. Well, the law of the excluded middle is just part and parcel of the Cartesian Aristotelian way of looking at reality. And a dialectical or paradoxical approach would not be governed by the law of the excluded middle. So that really fits in with what we've been saying so far today. Yeah. And I was going to say a little earlier that it's like we use the law of the law of the excluded middle where it's useful, but we are not controlled by it.
Yeah.
And that reminded me of this whole question of the relationship between Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics, where Newtonian physics is still upheld, but it's put within a context that limits its applicability. But I think we're dealing with a situation now that goes even further, because the Einsteinian approach, in a real sense, was governed by the law of the excluded middle.
Yeah.
And so Einstein, like Newton, thought in terms of the law of the excluded middle.
Indeed.
And were limited accordingly. I think that in order to really get beyond the law of the excluded middle in mathematics and in general, we've got to stop objectifying, because once we create objects appearing in a classically spatial context, and that space, the space could be a mathematical space.
Well, yeah.
And we speak about, traditionally, we speak about mathematical objects.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
As long as that kind of thinking controls us, we will not be able fundamentally to suspend the law of the excluded middle. So the law of the excluded middle will continue to be applied until we include ourselves in what we're dealing with. Otherwise, if we stand detached, then we have objects in front of us. They could be mathematical objects, and lurking at bottom will be the law of the excluded middle.
Yeah, definitely.
And conversely, embracing paradox means embracing it in an ontological way, means challenging the law of the excluded middle. I mean, I qualified it by talking about ontological paradox, because, I mean, there are lots of paradoxes that sit in front of us in an objectified way. We're not included in
No.
So it's still an objectification. But when subject starts including itself in the dealings with object, then we can have a true embrace of paradox that will suspend the domination of the law of the excluded middle. And the one thing I believe, my voice is a little strained. I had, at the beginning of last month, I had a bout with COVID. I'm perfectly fine now, but my voice continues to be a bit strained. What was I going to say, Hans?
The law of the excluded middle and the connection to Newtonian physics and how it's the domineering factor, not used in a thinking fashion. It's just
So to exclude the law of the excluded middle, we have to include ourselves, our own subjectivity, as happens in a phenomenological approach, our own subjectivity in the objects or others that we're dealing with. That's my basic point.
It was, for me, very illustrative what happened later in the 20th century when, in the end, the mathematical objects became so real and so detached, so they even got a life of their own. And people start claiming, and this happened around, oddly enough, when quantum physics, or maybe a decade earlier, they became so real. So people start talking about numbers being real without anyone ever thinking about them, ever calculating them, or never, ever would calculate or think of them. So they would exist somewhere because by then we became so detached, so they can sort of exist by their own with no contact to our
platonic heaven.
Yeah. And I'm a dull person. I don't change my line of thought, but that really helped me because I could get into that thinking, and I had it myself earlier on in the 90s. I was actually thinking that they exist. No one will ever think of them, but still they exist. And then I realized it's absolutely impossible. It's a nonsensical way of talking of existence. And in a way, I think that was also what Gödel felt for, looking for them as complete object in a coherent and consistent system that sort of obeyed, as he saw it, the law of the excluded middle to make a perfect system.
And it didn't work.
It didn't work. And the progenitor, who was Hilbert at the Paris conference in the 19th century, when he was told by Gödel this, he was gobsmacked. He was shocked. And Gödel himself, he stopped eating and starved himself to death in the end. So it was disaster because they were so into this madness, almost madness.
I mean, lives are at stake. This is literally life-threatening to people who have devoted their lives to thinking and acting in a certain way. When it's challenged, their lives are threatened.
Oh yeah, definitely, and it's an incredible blow. But I also, that goes to show how far we are willing to take it, like almost ending our thinking capacity, not being humans like souls anymore, with intention, will, wants. And no, we can't even, in a Heideggerian fashion, ask the why question. No longer is there a why. We just simply exist inside the Cartesian space. Something of that sort, I was thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first step is to be able to see how we're entrapped within a certain framework, a Cartesian framework. And that requires being able to get a sense of how I am functioning. I see myself trapped in this framework. But just to be able to get that sense of how I am functioning within this framework is already a step, a small step outside of the framework. And this ability to see how I am functioning, rather than just looking out at objects before me, to look within as I'm looking out and see how I am relating to those objects. This activity of being able to see one's own process is, as we've discussed, proprioception.
Oh, yes, yes, definitely.
And David Bohm was very big on that.
Proprioceptive thinking. Yes, I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, so, to get out of this enclosure within a fixed framework that has ruled our lives requires an act of self-awareness, a concrete self-awareness. The word proprioception, etymologically, it means taking oneself, proprious self and ception, the act of taking. I have to take myself in if I'm trapped in a certain way. So anyway, yeah.
I got the feeling, as you say, proprioception, it maybe in that sort of system, and now I'm going out on a limb here, and maybe in the Gödelian system, it wouldn't be, I can't see how it would be possible to have an awareness, because everything seems to be not literally, but metaphorically on the same level, to make consistency and coherency between the axioms and the theorems. There couldn't be any awareness there. Couldn't be any proprioception of me as a thinking subject somehow.
But don't you reach the point, Hans, where, in what Gödel didn't he reach the point of realizing that we cannot have a complete system? And the goals of, traditional mathematics to create a system that is complete and comprehensive and without contradiction is, Gödel realized that that can't be done. No. So isn't an awareness of the limitations of the enclosed system? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, something of that sort. And how
so it also mathematical proprioception, right?
And how that also sort of blocks out in me the possibility of proprioception, feeling my thoughts, feeling my feelings, even my body in the case of Gödel, who could no longer feel his hunger. And by then, sort of...
So you're saying, I'm just trying to, fully understand what you're saying. And I have an idea now that it might be that Gödel realized that we could not have a complete and consistent system. And when he realized, so he had that much proprioceptive ability to realize.
Yes.
But he couldn't take it. He couldn't swallow it.
No.
Okay. It's almost like what happened with Nietzsche, right?
Yeah.
He could not, Thus Spake Zarathustra, his main character couldn't swallow the serpent.
Oh, yeah, well, you remember, yeah.
So the serpent was this paradoxical force that was challenging Zarathustra, bringing Zarathustra down to earth and when Zarathustra confronted the serpent, he couldn't swallow it. He couldn't deal with it. So instead, he bit its head off. In Nietzsche's account, Zarathustra bit the serpent's head off, and then Zarathustra went mad.
Yeah.
He heard this weird laughter. So now back to Gödel. He encountered the serpent in the form of a mathematical system that cannot be comprehensive and at the same time consistent. He couldn't swallow the serpent. He couldn't deal with it.
No.
This small proprioceptive insight was too much for him.
Yes.
And therefore, he followed Nietzsche.
Yeah, in his madness. Yes,
Does that
definitely.
make sense to you? Or
Yeah, that's.
and I have it right in my interpretation of what you're saying. Do I not?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Just
If
wanted
he
to be
wouldn't
sure.
have even the slightest proprioception, he would have been fine and not having problem with his discovery, but he had enough to make him insane.
And our challenge is to do the proprioception without becoming insane. we be insane. We become insane when everything we've believed in the past is challenged.
Yeah, of course.
And if we can face those challenges without losing it completely, that's the goal, to be able to do that.
It is the goal. And I would say I can feel in myself there is a fear there in your article, the apeiron, treating the apeiron. I also got a feeling that that is me fearing knowledge in a way. In this only symmetrical system, maybe the Gödelian system, you generalize everything and you never reach into a deeper understanding, no depth, the depth dimension. And in this superficiality, you think you have, let's say, information, not to call it knowledge, but in the apeiron sort of, so to speak, it's true knowledge. And when you're so used to, as I was once upon a time, so used to this symmetrical Gödelian thinking, you fear it almost. It's something disliked. It's in the first feel was it's something not coherent. It doesn't have this glossiness of being only superficial. It has a lot of different properties, being irregular, not being like the Cartesian space, homogeneous, every point equidistantly. No matter what point in the universe, according to Newton, didn't matter where you were, equidistance would always be kept somehow, which is crazy, but it is what most of us believe somehow. But realizing at the first time, in the beginning, it could feel that you're falling into a rough area where everything is different and there is this almost body feeling of fleshiness of the world that is different, it's rough, it's fractal, and it contains all this knowledge, and you can't in the beginning just take it, you start fearing it or trying to get rid of it.
Did I ever tell you the story? I may have told you this before, but it comes to mind at the moment and seems appropriate. I was giving a talk, I don't know, 30 years ago or so or more. And I was presenting the Klein bottle. And when I finished the talk, someone in the audience got up and said, you know, when I see the Klein bottle and hear what you say about it, it makes me sick to my stomach.
Yes, I can relate.
Somehow I've kept my food down for the last 50 years.
Yeah, indeed, Steve. Indeed, Steve. Uh, but of course, it is the savior, and once you relax in the new situation, you start liking it, and you change your initial sickness, or your fear, or your phobia, or what it be.
Well, you swallow the serpent and don't throw up.
No, no, definitely.
You start swallowing it. We have a lot of digestive metaphors today.
Yeah, today, yeah. It's been a lot of eating this weekend. A lot to digest.
When we're finished, I'm going to go have lunch. So,
Oh, sounds lovely. I have a small one here, and I am not even sure if I can express it properly. I give it a first try, and if it doesn't work, maybe I can get another try at some future event. And I also been reading Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, and I saw a parallel there because he's talking about. Well, I focused on two things. Perception was one, and the other one was thinking. And he uses this very odd way of almost artistic with an R, to show the reader. And he said, when it comes to perception, is it only, no matter what sort of context you're using the word perception, is it about something inner, taking in something outer only? So that you have an inner perception of the outsideness, and which is of course leading to paradoxes with a homunculus looking at a screen inside the head. He questioned that. He questions that in an indirect manner, saying that maybe we're using the word perception or perception in different ways. So when I perceive something, that is one level or one language game. But if you ask me, Hans, did you see the man to the right? You are not interested in what I perceive, my inner world. It doesn't originate in my inner world. You're interested if there was a man in to the right. And I think he's sort of looking at the same thing here. This fixation with the being only one level, the outside world, I take it in, and it's a perception. And from that perception starts everything else in a causal manner or hierarchical manner. So I first have a perception, and then you ask me, did you see the man to the right? I go to my perception and I tell you, yes, I saw him.
mm-hmm.
It is oddly similar. He's almost like he's questioning this subject in front of an object in space, put in completely different terms, other words completely.
I'm thinking that the relationship between inside and outside is also at play in what you're describing.
Yeah.
Is it an inner experience? Am I taking in what appears before me? or does it involve something outside of me? So I think a lot of confusion can revolve around this, again, dualism of inside and outside. Is it inside? No, maybe it's outside.
Yeah, yeah.
And when you have, and again, the Klein bottle.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Climb. I was, yeah, great. Yeah, climb bottle, definitely.
So, I mean, I guess it's the same with language. As long as we're going to be using our language, and when I say language, of course, I mean the language of the dominant language of Western culture for many centuries, since the Greeks introduced alphabetic language. As long as we're going to be using this language, which is built on dualism, there are going to be these conundrums, and there'll be paradoxes that we can't embrace, paradoxes that throw us for a loop, that make us nauseous.
Yeah.
Is it inside? Is it outside? Is it coming
Yes.
from me? Is it coming from the man to my left? And all of that. So I don't know if that really addresses your basic question, but that was my thought when you were describing, Wittgenstein and his thoughts on it.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. It's not so much as it's only on the outside, it's only on the inside. It's more that if it's differentiated too much, it would be even hard to put them together again. It's this initial separation. If it's too hard, that's the confusion.
Yeah. I mean, once the separation is there, as it is in our language, then it makes it easy to get confused.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We had a couple of weeks ago here a visit by an Indian, North American Indian, and in his language was I think Lakota language. There are no nouns, if I remember correctly, no adjectives, no adverbs, no property words, and he learned English when he was at a conscious age, I think maybe 7, 8, 9, something like that. And we asked him, how did it feel? Did you have any first feeling about nouns, for instance, when you encounter them? And he got this like expression in his face, like he didn't really like that first feel, and it was almost like the things had come to a standstill. One no longer participatory in the language game or in the Klein bottle. They were sort of deadened. And then he had to construct all this new life world that began. I think our language almost begins with the detached object. And I'm not sure, but I think there's some linguist who says it all comes from the nominal phrase. It starts here, and the verbs are like almost secondary, which is like shocking. And he really felt that somehow. In his face, his whole demeanor changed noticeably. And I was sitting close to him. I felt it like in the atmosphere as well. It's like he wanted to shake it off almost.
Well, very, very interesting. Yeah. He might have felt when confronted with the domination of nouns, like he was being imprisoned, like he was being restricted, like his movements were being constrained. I imagine, yeah, that the flow of experience was frozen and, lost its fluidity. What do you think? I imagine that he might have felt something like that, but it would really be interesting to have more detail from him on what he just what he experienced. Have you come across this book called The Spell of the Sensuous by a man named David Abram?
David Abrams. Yes, I have. Yeah.
And he writes very interestingly about this issue of, non-Western language and indigenous language and how the ways in which it's different from what we have been dealing with our own dominant language.
Could maybe try to ask him a bit more in depth what his reactions were.
That would be very interesting. Yeah. If you get a chance, I'd be interested in hearing what he had to say about it.
I almost also got like a feeling this Heidegger writes about Danken and Denken, and that this is more the Western way is more Denken, like a friction-like way of forcing the thinking, which is not Danken, thankful, not gracious.
I love that distinction in Heidegger, but between this old medieval use of the term, the German term Danken, and giving thanks. Language as a giving thanks, so different from what language has become. Language has become a weapon. It's been weaponized.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's more like a language of the heart.
A more felt language, more with more grace. He spoke, this Indian, he spoke, it sounded beautiful, Steve. It had force.
Mm.
It felt whole, and his whole body sort of reverberated with not my squeaky Western voice, or Swedish even worse, maybe, I don't know. But it was force to it, but it was a gentle force.
Yeah.
It felt friendly.
Somehow English has become the dominant language in the world, and that may be saying not too much for English, because in the world we're living in, language has really become extremely destructive. So does the adoption of English as the world language tell us something about the destructiveness of the English language? I know my son has embraced Esperanto.
Oh,
My son has a radio program. He lives in Leipzig, and he has a radio program and sometimes features songs in Esperanto, and he's very
wow.
involved with the Esperanto movement. And I don't know if Esperanto does it any better, but it gives us a breather. I don't speak it. But for people who do speak it, it gives them a breather from this monolinguistic domination.
Oh, Esperanto. And he lives in Leipzig?
Yep.
Wow.
Oh yeah, he's been there for 30 years.
Wow. Yeah, it could be a break there. Esperanto, that
It's a
was
lovely, Leipzig is a lovely city. I really like it.
never been though, even though I'm on the right side of the planet, so to speak.
Well, it's an hour and a half train ride from Berlin, which I also love. We've quite liked Berlin in our visits there.
Yeah, Berlin is a lovely town. It's a lovely town.
Yeah.
Well, sounds good. Maybe we should leave you to your luncheon. We've been speaking so much digestive material. I'm really happy. I came to some new insight, and thank you very much, Steve, for
Well, the material we've been speaking about has gone down well. I've digested it, and now I'm ready for some yogurt to complete the job.
Very good, Steve. Fantastic.
All right, my friend.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your
Pleasure.
help. It's been very insightful.
Thank
I'd
you.
love to hear back to you at some instant. Keep in contact over the net.
Let's do that. Let's do that, and take care. Good luck with whatever you're doing, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you very much. Bon appetit. Bye bye. Do take care.
Thanks.